Please give a warm welcome to Miss Perri Adams.
Hi, my name is Perri Adams, and I'm a program manager in DARPA's Information Innovations Office, where I focus on the intersection between computer science and cybersecurity. I have been looking forward to this panel for quite a while, not just because of how timely and relevant the subject matter is, but because of the fantastic group of experts we have with us today to give us a comprehensive understanding of the nexus between cybercrime and nation states. Now, I would be surprised if anyone here has not been affected by cybercriminal activity in recent years. That might mean being the victim of a ransomware attack. That might mean having your data breached when an attacker goes after a company with which you've interacted. But that can also mean the third and fourth order effects of this activity. So for instance, in the summer of 2021, Colonial Pipeline, a major gas distributor, was affected by a ransomware attack. And in response, they shut down their pipeline. Now, this caused a major gas shortage on the East Coast. I was stuck in a line at a gas station. I'm sure some of you who were there were also in that situation. It also had about $1 billion in economic damage stemming from that shutdown. And so when we talk about cybercrime, we often focus on these effects, or we might talk about the cybersecurity issues that led to the crimes. But one issue that goes under-discussed is the role that nation states play in enabling this activity. And in fact, I'd say that enabling really understates it. Nation states play a fundamental role in the cybercriminal ecosystem. One could argue that it's impossible to understand modern cybercriminal activity without its geopolitical attributes. So not only has cybercrime had such a deleterious effect on the US economy, not only are we seeing critical infrastructure, US critical infrastructure being affected by cybercrime, but we're also seeing it become a crucial tool in the toolbox of US adversaries. And this makes it a fundamental problem to solve for US national security. So DARPA has focused on securing our computers for years and securing the networks on which those computers reside. DARPA is also focused on detecting and responding when an attacker, that might be a cybercriminal, that might be a nation state, or as we'll discuss today, an amorphous combination of the two, gets in. But in addition to that, DARPA has focused on the attribution element of this. How do we tell whether it's a cybercriminal, whether it's a nation state, whether it's some combination that is affecting our networks? DARPA Chase and DARPA Hacks have focused on that detect and response problem. And DARPA Smoke, which kicked off just last month, is going to research how we do attribution in this space in part. And in fact, some of the research that's been done on some of those programs happened here at Georgia Tech. Now, one thing that is so important about having these panelists here today is that because there's so much more that needs to be done in this space, it's incredibly important that we have experts here to explain to the broader research community the intricacies of such a complicated industry, such as cybercrime, and the role that nation states play in it. And so the last thing I'll say before we get our panelists on stage is that another aspect of cybercrime that also goes underappreciated is the role, and this may be surprising to some people, of cryptocurrency. And now, whatever you think of cryptocurrency, the fact that cybercriminals are able to engage in anonymous transactions outside of traditional financial institutions is one of the driving factors of cybercrime today. And in fact, the rise in cybercrime has tracked the rise in the value of some of these assets. And so understanding how we can perform forensics in this space, how we can actually track the financial transactions occurring, and how we can defend against cybercrime even when they are happening outside of traditional avenues is incredibly important to defending against it. So first, on that note, I'd like to welcome Chafin-Lomonosov to the stage. She is a senior crimes investigator at Chainalysis, which is a company that specializes in forensics on blockchain-based data for both the public and private sectors. She has spent the past decade supporting the U.S. intelligence community, where she focused on counter-threat financial analysis and reporting. Thank you, Ashley. Now, second, I'd like to welcome Juan Guerrero-Saade to the stage, and he goes by his initials JAGS. He is the Senior Director of Sentinel Labs at SentinelOne, and he's an adjunct professor at the Johns Hopkins Alperovitch Institute for Cybersecurity Studies. Prior to this, he was Chronicle's Security Research Czar, and his research is featured in a permanent exhibit at the International Spy Museum in Washington, D.C. And then finally, I'm incredibly excited to welcome Kimberly Goody to the stage. She is the Director of Financial Crimes Analysis at Mandiant Intelligence. And there she focuses on a range of financially motivated cyber threats, like ransomware, payment card theft, and actors operating on the dark web to monetize stolen information, which we'll get into today. Previously, she was an analyst at the National Cyber Forensics and Training Alliance, and there she collaborated with government agencies and private sector partners to investigate threats affecting the financial services industry. She's also taught a graduate level course on cybercrime at Georgetown University. Welcome, everyone. It's great to have you with us today. Kimberly, I'd like to start with you. Can you give us an overview of the modern cybercriminal ecosystem? It's not just ransomware that we're seeing occur.
Yeah, that's right. So when we look at cybercrime activity, whenever we are doing our research and analysis, we are looking broadly across various underground communities. And these are communities where cybercriminals go to exchange goods and services with one another. Often these are in different languages, right? So when we're looking at Russian cybercriminals, the primary language being spoken there is Russian, and so it's really important to have native translators whenever you are looking at this activity. But we see a broad range of malware being advertised on these communities, everything from ransomware to web skimmers that will steal payment credentials from online shopping sites. We'll also see various services like actors offering code signing certificates that actors can use to sign their malware to make it look more legitimate whenever they are deploying it at a victim organization. And we see services like setting up infrastructure that they can leverage for campaigns. And so, historically, we saw a lot of actors that were involved in the theft of payment card data, ransomware, extortion, the theft of data and threatening to release that online. Those are definitely the most common types of crimes that we do see today. But there's also activities like cryptocurrency mining as well that are being conducted by various threat actors.
And when you say cryptocurrency mining, can you explain for us what that is?
Yeah, I'd actually pass that to Ashley. You're probably better qualified to answer that one than me.
That's very true.
I do work in that industry. So what crypto mining is and how it looks in an illicit context is most commonly that an illicit actor will deploy malware on a system where the unfortunate target is just an unwitting individual at that point. And what they'll do is use their computing power and energy provided, again, without their knowledge, to mine cryptocurrency or basically make new cryptocurrency, which just then goes back into the pockets of the cybercriminals.
So I might find, a piece of malware on my computer using a certain amount of my compute power to just mine a little bit of cryptocurrency. And if this is on just enough computers, that actually starts to be very profitable for these actors.
It's an extremely profitable industry. And clearly this malware is going undetected, and it's using such a relatively small amount of computing power that you're not going to notice it as a victim. So it's just a very unfortunate circumstance. But blockchain forensics shows that that happens pretty frequently still. It was certainly a lot more common back in 2017, 2018. It's not necessarily the most profitable way. It's a lot easier to steal things, I think, these days, especially in terms of crypto. But yes, a very unfortunate circumstance from a couple of years ago.
Yeah, so
still happens.
Yeah, so it's ransomware, but also stealing these credentials, reselling them, mining cryptocurrency, maybe stealing cryptocurrency from people's wallets, selling other things that can be stolen online. Can you help us understand the financial aspects of this? How are cybercriminals able to launder money in this space today?
Stealing it, moving it. No, there are very, very many methods of obfuscation these days. And without getting into blockchain 101 entirely, where this tails is cryptocurrency allows some degree of pseudonymity. Like, you can't really attribute what goes on a blockchain to an individual necessarily until there's a point where the traditional financial system gets involved or computer forensics get involved. And such as buying credentials off of a darknet market, off of the dark web as a whole, the easiest way to do that is probably not to pay with the credit card attached to your name and your bank account. In terms of other methods of obfuscation, there are many. There are softwares and codified programs on the blockchain that are programmed to do just that and served for just that purpose, where it disconnects the trail of funds, basically. And then further, there are change of hands patterns that we look for, where you have individuals moving funds on behalf of another person, and disconnecting the chain of custody is another way to hide in plain sight on the blockchain.
And so I just want to remain on this for one more question. Can you help us understand, because this is a research audience interested in how we can develop technical solutions to this problem. So what ways do we perform forensics on, let's say, blockchain transactions to actually trace it back to the cyber actor?
Blockchain tracing is a lot of clicking and guessing. There are several analytical methods that go into what we call crypto tracing. The easiest way to track a criminal is wait for the human error to take over. So inevitably, at some point, a human will be involved, maybe a human that's not necessarily intelligent, or maybe their VPN fails to a certain degree. And at that point, between very, very large industry base and a lot of partnerships, we can then identify individuals or entities, groups as a whole on the blockchain. So what that actually looks like in terms of tracing is, we're tracing across many different blockchains, many different types of cryptocurrency, through many different financial institutions in partnership with US FBI and global law enforcement. But ultimately what it comes down to is a lot of public-private partnership.
One thing that I would also add there that's really interesting, and I think probably this is a testament really to a lot of the work, Ashley, you do at your company, is that cybercriminals have actually noticed that we are getting better at being able to track Bitcoin transactions. And so we'll see them do things like offering a discount if a victim actually pays with Monero, because they perceive us as a research community to be less good at being able to de-anonymize those transactions.
That is a very important part of our up-and-coming research. So to the tune of this panel, what we look at a lot of times is nation-state activity and other illicit group activity on the blockchain. And unfortunately, or fortunately, they're leveraging technology, depending on which side you're on there, to hide in plain sight. And what she mentioned was privacy coins, such as Monero. There are a few other shielded protocols, and in the decentralized finance space, which is an entirely different conversation, many smart contract-based programs that are programmed to do just that. So yes, we're beyond Bitcoin these days, and the cybercriminals are also beyond Bitcoin these days.
Jags, can you describe for us what some of these criminal groups look like? What does a modern Russian ransomware operation look like? I love this because it's almost a McDonald's franchise model, isn't it?
Yeah, there's definitely a franchise model to it. And frankly, we were discussing this backstage. I think part of the issue is we want to talk about ransomware groups or ransomware cartels, and they have this nice branding and image, which, I mean, the branding is actually important, right? When somebody ransoms your organization and they tell you that on faith, if you pay them $20 million in crypto, they're going to give you the decryption keys. I think branding does play a very important part. Like, can we trust Revil to give us the decryption keys?
Who is Revil?
Right, so that being one of these ransomware cartels, if you will. But in reality, it's not the right way to think about it per se. Like the franchise model that you mentioned, Perri, I think is a little more accurate. You have groups in this full ecosystem where you'll have folks that do the development of the malware, you have folks that take a cut and help manage, think about it, storage services in order to take all the data that you've stolen from an organization and host it somewhere. You have people that will do the initial intrusions and then deploy the malware. So there's an ecosystem that breaks itself apart into groups of developers and groups of affiliates. And it's important to note the affiliates because it's a little harder to track when you think of them in that cartel model. You can have affiliates that are using they're feeding multiple types of ransomware groups. So, you know, in case that the FBI raids one of them or disables their command and control infrastructure or takes all the money out of the Bitcoin wallets for whatever reason, it doesn't stop their operations. They can start, instead of serving McDonald's, they'll serve Burger King that day. It's very much an interconnected sphere.
Yeah, so these ransomware groups, they're almost like software companies. They have the software they're developing is the malware, right? They have their back and their data storage, et cetera, and then it's almost as if it's a service, and then people pay to leverage that malware. And those affiliates are doing the hard job of getting on target, getting onto these poor victims and ransomwaring their computers.
Right.
Can you describe for us some of the other kinds of criminal groups we're seeing and how they take shape? So,
I mean, it's a fairly variegated space, and it's more of a race to the bottom these days than anything else. So you've got the ransomware crews are sort of the thing that's in vogue right now, but before that you had a lot of banking credentials being stolen. You had folks even starting to hack banks directly, right? So 2015, with the rise of Carbon Act, it became a possibility in the collective mind that banks would be attacked directly. Banks had a very hard time accepting that, particularly in the US. Now it's something that we accept as just happening, and not only happening, but tying into even nation-state activity like North Korean attacks on SWIFT. But then you also have the much more embarrassing side of the house, where you'll have these underground groups of, you know, kids, people 17 to 22 and so on, that are willing to run these sort of extortion scams, doing activation, SIM swaps, et cetera. So they leverage the access that they have to large organizations and a lot of different ways to sort of tunnel back and forth into these orgs with high privilege accounts in order to, like, essentially commit petty crime or steal source code and try to extort folks. Even though they haven't ransomwared the org, they go, we have, you know, all the source code for Bing or Cortana or whatever, which they've actually done. You know, why don't you pay us $5 million and we'll all just walk away?
So Kimberly, can you, to get to the meat of the panel, can you describe for us the ways in which nation states actually interact with these groups? I think there's a variety of different models, if you will.
Yeah, certainly. So we have countries like North Korea being the prime example that is actually conducting cyber attacks for financial gain as a way to generate revenue for the state. And they do this at least partly because of all the sanctions that have been levied against them, and they do need to generate income somewhere, and so, you know, why not pull off a bank heist? Back in 2018, when we initially did our reporting on APT 38, we had estimated that they had stolen over $1 billion, or attempted to steal rather, over $1 billion from financial institutions around the globe. And from that perspective, you can see that it can be really profitable. I think another interesting aspect from North Korea specifically in the way that they conducted these operations was specifically by manipulating SWIFT transactions. And they built malware that was purposely designed to interact with the SWIFT system. So they actually were in victim environments for an extended period of time, sometimes for over a year, before they actually deployed this malware. And we think that's because they were spending time to learn about how they did their operations. We'd seen them actually update their malware mid-intrusion because one victim organization was using a PDF viewer to validate financial transactions versus printed documentation. And so you can see that they really gained an in-depth understanding of these victims' environments. On maybe the other end of the spectrum, we see countries like North Korea, or not North Korea, rather China, who actually seem to have actors that are conducting espionage activity, but are moonlighting as cybercriminals by night. And so when we look at operational tempo of attacks that we saw conducted by APT41 specifically, we saw them conducting espionage operations that really aligned with Chinese working hours. But then after that, we saw them use the same tools to actually target the gaming industry. And they would steal or generate in-game currencies that they would then deposit in these accounts and then presumably would likely sell in underground communities or launder in some other ways.
And the overlap there is actually very important, and I'm happy that you mentioned that, because that is where you see a lot of the individuals and really small group rogue actors that aren't necessarily connected to nation-state activity, or whether they know it or not, they may be. But that essentially acts as an off-road for a lot of the financial gain, like illicit financial gain that's happening these days. So they're either generating it themselves from a nation-state perspective, or at the hands of a nation-state, or otherwise, acquiring it in a less than legal way, and then cashing out through individuals who may or may not know that they're facilitating that activity.
So what I'm hearing is that we're seeing some nation states simply be the cyber criminals. So if you remove the mask, it's just North Korea staying there carrying out these operations. And actually, pretty explicitly, they go after banks, right? Not just carrying out ransomware operations, but they found it more profitable to actually go after just financial institutions directly. And then maybe with China, it's a little bit more of a hands-off model where China, and correct me if I'm wrong, but China allows some of these groups to essentially moonlight, right? They work by day by the government and can then moonlight doing cybercriminal activity on off hours.
Yeah, that's the assumption, right, is that they tolerate it and they kind of just ignore it. We see other cases with other states. So Russia's another great example of a country that has an interesting relationship with its cyber criminals. There was prior indictments that came out against Maxim Yakubets years ago and this was an individual who was involved in the Dridex criminal organization, and that was an organization that deployed banking malware for financial gain. And what we saw with the announcement of sanctions and the indictments against this individual was that the US government did have evidence that indicated that this person was being specifically tasked by the Russian government to also collect confidential information that would be of strategic intelligence value for them. And so, when it comes to Russia, they have seemingly developed these kind of mutually beneficial partnerships, right? Like Russia would not tolerate if those cyber criminals were targeting Russia, right? Like that is off bounds. They actually design their malware so that it will not infect machines in certain countries to avoid those law enforcement repercussions. But because they're targeting Western countries, they're okay with it. And then we'll see them actually co-opt these cyber criminals or these cyber criminal tools for operations that may be of strategic value for the Russian government.
I think it's important to kind of understand that it isn't, there's an assumption that everything in Russia is sort of being controlled and masterminded in some perfectly orchestrated way, and I think that's giving them too much credit. The way that it ends up working is ultimately, you might have a criminal group that's being given, a roof, they're being given protection to some extent. What we'll end up seeing is a lot of the folks that end up getting indicted or who end up, on particular lists who are not able to travel, there seems to be the situation where you get a bit of a recruitment pitch. So even historically, if you go back to, I want to say 2013, Game Over Seuss, which was an incredibly prolific carding malware,
Sorry, what kind of malware?
It was called Game Over Seuss. It was this giant like carding botnet essentially, and it ran in that same sort of affiliate model. You had someone at the top that was developing the malware, and a lot of folks that got to use it. What's interesting is after this individual, whose name escapes me right this second.
Gorbachev.
There you go. After he gets put in like the FBI most wanted list, not only was he never caught, and folks don't really know where he is, there's an assumption that he's in Russia, but also there was a modification to the malware in certain countries where it would start to collect, it would attempt to collect information on intelligence officers in Georgia and Turkey and countries surrounding and sort of an interest of Russia. So that wasn't the plan. It wasn't the way that the whole operation was designed. It's sort of opportunistic and saying, well, now you're in trouble. We're here to help you. Why don't you also provide some value to the state?
Can you describe for us the benefit that this kind of impunity that the Russian government allows cyber operators, the way in which it enables these operations to continue to occur?
I mean, it's mutually beneficial, right? With a lot of cybercrime, there is this perception of sort of whack-a-mole, right? You take down the malware, they develop new malware, or they get new malware. You take down the initial access, well, they'll go to a different initial access broker, get a different type of access into an organization. It can be very frustrating, which is why, I admire the work that you're both doing. I tend to hide in the nation-state cyber espionage side where you don't have to, deal with that level of complexity, perhaps. But what you see is, in being unable to arrest these folks, being unable to put any kind of pressure on them, it creates a mutually beneficial ecosystem where they continue to hack, they continue to steal, they continue, they drive their Lambos around Moscow with impunity, and at the same time, it almost creates a buffer, if you will. Like we've talked about North Korea and Iran, nations that have been sanctioned extensively and essentially forced into more of an antisocial pattern where you go, well, we're already, North Korea, we're already sanctioned, who cares, right? If we can steal, if we can make some money in an untraceable fashion, who cares? Well, what's going to happen with a Russia that's increasingly sanctioned and has a backbench of some of the most prolific ransomware groups? When the leaks for Conti happened recently,
which is a ransomware.
It's another ransomware group, a particularly prolific one at the time. I believe the leaks included something like $1 billion worth of cryptocurrency in their wallets. Like that's something that it may have gone under the radar when it was just protecting an unaffiliated group operating within Russia. What happens when you're properly sanctioned and you don't have external funds in order to fuel your operations?
So it's a negotiating tool. The fact that they're giving safe harbor to these groups, they can use that as a geopolitical negotiating tool. I think we've actually seen Russia do that as the U.S. has tried to get them to address these issues. Actually, one thing that I'd also like to understand is the role that Russia plays in converting between the cryptocurrency that these criminals are deriving from their activity and fiat currency, right? I believe that there's quite an industry in Moscow to do this.
So one interesting point to answer this question is when all of these ransomware groups and ransomware groups that are allegedly based out of Russia or Russia connected in some way, they get all these funds and then they do have to offload them, or if the Russian government's involved, there may be a payoff or some sort of penalty for doing this, but also perhaps a direction to do so. So one thing that we find very, very interesting and oftentimes very insightful is what happens to the crypto after they receive it. Whether it's a giant ransomware case and a very public one, or companies who just pay the ransom and hope the word never gets out, these funds are constantly flowing through these wallets. And well, if they're converting it to fiat currency, it is in presumably very old-fashioned ways. But one trend that we're noticing recently is that perhaps they're not actually converting it to fiat currency. Now, I will say that's a little bit dated because now that Russia is cut off from the global financial system, they really don't care what the value of their ruble is because they're finding other ways to make do. And that's possibly handshakes with other countries who are also cut off from the global financial system. So to answer your question, what it used to be was there is a very, very large collection of businesses in Moscow, central city, called Federation Tower. And if you haven't heard of Federation Tower, it's like this probably more than 30-something floor building with too many companies for any possible number of offices registered to this office building.
It's like Delaware.
And it's really like Delaware of Moscow. But there were over-the-counter brokers or people who, businesses who make a livelihood on taking fees for converting between currencies, fiat currencies, and then they dove into the crypto space. Now, a lot of these are shell companies. There's always a question as to like what their actual purpose is, or if they actually do exist, or if they're covers for something else. But yes, there could have been a fiat off-ramp there. And obviously they're working with Russian and Russian-friendly banks, right? So it's probably rubles or something else that they do have access to. And if you put a couple more mules in the way, you have no connection to the on-chain crypto.
There's another aspect I would also mention is even like 2016, when you would see actual Russian state-affiliated groups doing some small amount of cybercrime, it was precisely because it helped get unattributable services that they would use as part of their operations. So even on the official side, right, you look at APT28, Fancy Bear.
And these are Russian.
Yeah,
APT,
well,
Advanced Persistent
Advanced
Threat.
Persistent Threat 28, as you know, our friends would call them, which we have like 12 names of art for every one group because everybody comes up with their own, right? So you might have heard of Fancy Bear back in the summer of election hacks. Well, that one in particular is believed to be affiliated with the GRU, with military intelligence on the Russian side. So what you would, there was a time when they were actually looking for wallets and sort of stealing cryptocurrency, but instead of being for particular personal gain, as far as we could tell, they were using it to like anonymously pay for the servers that they would use to hack US organizations. So you start to find like places where you hit a wall precisely because it's illicit funds being used directly to pay off, you know, burnable infrastructure that they're going to use to enable their operations. So there's a lot of ways in which cryptocurrency, it doesn't even necessarily have to turn into fiat, but it becomes incredibly useful.
Yeah, those profits are just reinvested in the business. Now, one other thing, while we're on the subject of Russia, that I'd like to tease out is my understanding is that in some ways the deal that the Russian government makes with their cyber criminals is almost like a reservist situation where these cyber criminals, these ransomware operators, get essentially called up when needed by the Russian government, perhaps in the context of Ukraine. Kimberly, I believe you guys have done some work on this space.
Yeah, I think it's fair to maybe think of them kind of as a reservist type of army that you can tap into when you need it. I mean, the alternative for these cyber criminals, right, is to be thrown in jail, and that doesn't really seem very pleasant. So, I mean, it's like you do these things that the state asks you if they ask you to do it, or you suffer very negative consequences. And so who's going to really say no to that? What we've actually seen is, so we mentioned Conti, a ransomware earlier, and after the Ukraine war, what we saw, or after it began rather, what we saw is some of the tools that were in this ecosystem and used by those affiliates and developed by the development crew that's also responsible for the development of TrickBot malware. We saw them used in attacks that were actually targeting Ukrainian organizations. And it's hard to say in this case whether those were specifically directed by the Russian government, because we can't rule out a scenario like the fact that these could be patriotic hackers. And we saw references whenever we looked through the chats about some of these cyber criminals thinking that they do have this patriotic duty and that they have this willingness to proactively steal documentation that would be of strategic value for Russia and then provide that to maybe contacts that they have in the law enforcement or intelligence community. And so, you know, the bottom line is that we have seen attacks using cybercrime malware like Iced ID or Anchor Mail, which were, you know, in the Conti sphere, that have been used to conduct campaigns that were targeting specifically Ukrainian organizations, which was atypical for prior attacks by the same actors.
And before we get to audience questions, I want to touch on that ambiguity you're getting at very quickly. And Jake, can you explain to us the difficulties that come with actually attributing these attacks? Like, how do we tell if it's a criminal or if it's a nation state? And why is that attribution important?
Well, it's actually a fairly complex problem and an unsatisfying one in a lot of ways, right? So part of the issue with technical attribution is that most technical indicators are relatively fungible to lesser and greater degree, and we're getting to a point where as threat intelligence becomes more of a private sector industry rather than happening in the intelligence community, there's also a lot of potential for attempts at false flagging, which we've seen, right? If I try to pretend to be a ransomware group, but in reality, I'm an Iranian crew, it just happened in Albania a few months ago. It's a cover for action for the kind of activities that we see. So the attribution problem, in a lot of ways, it's beyond what the private sector can do on their own. We tend to sort of piggyback or work in relations with the governments, and a lot of the intelligence community or law enforcement tends to have sort of the critical missing pieces to make it more of all source attribution, which is what you'd hope for. But from the technical indicator side, at most we can say, with a certain level of confidence, we know that there's all this infrastructure involved, there's all this, closed source malware involved. We might even get to a developer if we get very lucky, but there's a barrier at that point as to how you translate that into actual, individuals and entities.
So we're actually seeing nation states pretend to be ransomware operators, but to actually carry out geopolitical goals?
Yes. So we see that the Iranian case is quite interesting, where they attacked Albania a couple of months ago under the cover of sort of ransoming their government organizations. We worked with CISA, NATO, and a number of other partners. Microsoft did as well, sort of on their own end. And what you end up getting is that they're quite well tied into known Iranian operators in this case. But there's also a lot of cases where hacktivism is used as a cover for action for nation-state groups. I mean, it happened with APT-28, the Russians in the summer of election hacks. It also happened recently in a lot of sort of this proxy cyber war between Israel and Iran, where you see a lot of sort of hacktivist crews appear overnight that you've never heard of before, carrying out things that are conveniently aligned with state interests. There's a lot of ways in which they just kind of want to hide the hand of the state behind this.
I think that's one important point that we've kind of skirted around but haven't explicitly said, is that the use of cyber, co-opting tools that are actually used by financially motivated threat actors, when a country does that, it does give them some sort of plausible deniability. The same with, masking your disruptive attack as a ransomware attack. It gives you that plausible deniability, and it makes, confidently attributing that activity to a certain country a little bit more challenging.
So actually jumping off of this, we have our first audience question, and I'll give just a little background. With the rise of cybercrime has led to cyber insurance, right? So companies want to protect themselves against being the financial impact of being ransomware with cyber insurance. And part of that, what comes with this cyber insurance is, to read the question, there are often limitations based on whether an attack was part of an act of war or conducted by a nation state. Right, so I think what the question is asking is that cyber insurance often will have different provisions whether the folks are being targeted by a country rather than a criminal group. So as ransomware and nation-state activities continue to blend, what should we be thinking about to mature the cyber insurance marketplace?
I mean, the cyber insurance marketplace was, look, I'll be very frank about this. I think it was a fairly misguided attempt in many ways to sort of offload the financial concern. And at the time, there was an expectation that the financial load on the banks was going to be in some way lesser than it was going to be on companies. And I think we're seeing that that's not the case, right? So the issue of cyber insurance is fairly complex in that we see for example, the ransoms going through the roof. Now that you're seeing attempts to ransom organizations for 8-figure sums. Insurance doesn't necessarily make quite as much sense anymore. So what you're seeing is a pushback on multiple levels. One of them is, how do we assure the posture of this organization, that they're actually in compliance, that they're actually trying to defend themselves rather than just waiting and trying to offload the bill to a bank. And then with the nation-state problem, I think famously there was this NotPetya malware, which, pardon for naming it so stupidly.
The joke is that Jags was the one that came up with the name.
Yeah, I didn't think
which
it was going to be.
a major Russian cyber attack that actually took down Maersk, the shipping company, and caused just billions in damage.
I didn't think it was going to be that significant at the time, and we gave it a very stupid internal name, and that has now stuck, unfortunately. But the issue was, you had this Russian operation, GRU operation, to deploy fake ransomware across all of Ukraine through a supply chain attack, software supply chain attack. And it was specifically targeted at Ukraine. It was meant to spread in a way that was rather indiscriminate. So it actually did spread not just through a bunch of Ukrainian organizations, but it affected FedEx and Merck and Maersk and a bunch of other organizations. And the issue there is, I mean, you have a legitimate operation. It pretends to be ransomware at least, and you can eventually see the hand of a government involved. But this idea that you can make it seem like that's an act of God, or like a hurricane came through and destroyed our operations, it doesn't quite line up. And you see that in Merck winning their case against their cyber insurance provider to the tune of like $1.something billion recently. So it's far from an easy to decide question. And if you're going to rely on our ability to attribute the activity before you provide coverage, I think that's kind of a treacherous proposition.
So we have another question. What, if any, are the indications that cybercriminals are going after larger targets tied to critical infrastructure, and what's being done to counter it? Who wants to?
I mean, I'll start off. I mean, historically, whenever we looked at things like ransomware attacks, they were kind of very opportunistic, but we have seen threat actors realize, like, if we target more profitable industries, or we target industries that are going to have more, impact from downtime, that they're more likely to pay us. We see that with things like hospitals and some actors talking about how they pay so quickly because they have to get up, in running more quickly. We see like this shift, right, from this opportunistic mindset to actors very intentionally choosing to target some industries. And so, I would say, yes, there's definitely indications that actors have moved that way over time. From the perspective of like, what are people doing about it? I mean, I can only speak from my perspective. But I think like we've been more willing as a community, especially when it comes to critical infrastructure, to be quicker about sharing intelligence about these attacks and then getting that out the door. I mean, I think the US government did a really good job of that when we look back in 2020, when they put out that warning about the attacks that were impending against hospitals. And if you looked at the leaked check data from Conti, you actually saw that came out like literally within days of the actors discussing targeting hospitals, which is, for the government, that's a very quick response time, in my opinion. And so I think being able to share that intelligence within the community, there is a lot of that going on behind the scenes. And I think that that's helpful from the perspective of at least my job in order to protect our clients, but I'm sure there's other things.
Yeah, you've actually touched on something that's very critical to the space. Can you talk more about the role that sharing intelligence plays, why it's so crucial, and the technical challenges that we run into with it?
Sure. It's incredibly important that everybody owns a different slice of the pie, right? Like, we're DARPA audience, right? Thank you for the internet. At the end of the day, the internet isn't really the homogeneous entity that we like to make it out to seem. It's actually fragmented and owned in many different ways and positioned in many different places. And what that becomes is you don't have this sort of omniscient single source of all telemetry that you would hope to have. Different providers for incident response will have different pieces of the pie. Providers for, let's say the on-chain visibility have different pieces of the pie. And like, we have telemetry on systems from the EDR, XDR perspective. Then you have...
And that's endpoint security.
Yeah, endpoint security.
Antivirus type. It's
the only thing that will see what's going on your system. Then you want to tie that with what happens from the ISPs, from the internet service providers, from the people that rent you virtual private servers, from the people who register domains. And you really need to have all these pieces to tie together the full extent of an operation. So some level of collaboration is incredibly important. Right now, we have big problems in having that level of sharing internationally, and in some cases, we have big problems having that level of sharing just within U.S. government, different organizations, and getting folks to work with declassifying relevant data, work with getting the right folks in the right rooms. But I think, as Kimberly points out, like, we have a shared interest in trying to keep these operations from really scaling. And one of the biggest issues we have with ransomware is some provider along the way will see that the operation is starting up, or they'll see that exfiltration is happening at an important organization like Colonial Pipeline, right? That doesn't translate into immediate defense. Like, it's very, very hard to then, what do? Do you drive up to Colonial and knock on their door? Do you ask the FBI? Will the FBI know that this is important and they should go beat the door down, right? US government can't force Colonial to attend to this. So there is a kind of frustrating offloading, onloading of intelligence and trying to get folks to take relevant action while these actors are essentially probing different sectors to see who's going to pay faster, who's less defended. And critical infrastructure has gotten into the middle of that. But look at where they are now. If you look at Costa Rica, the entire government is shut down because of an attack from Conti. So you're getting to a point where you go, okay, now they're trying whole governments in Latin America. Who's going to pay? Who's more profitable? Who's fastest? And we're sort of on the back heel trying to respond to this.
Yeah, so right before we end, Ashley, I know there's some financial aspects to tracking this as well, in the sharing aspect, right?
I think one thing that hasn't really been covered is from a consumer or potential victim perspective. Companies are starting to take notice. CISA, FBI, a bunch of different agencies have done a phenomenal job sharing that information with the public. And I wouldn't say more oftentimes than not, but more frequently these days, they're just not paying ransoms. They're wiping their systems and using the backups that they have saved so regularly to just start business again as is. So while that's not always possible, and hospitals pose a very, very significant threat, and that it's almost impossible to back those up as much as they need to, we're doing a good job.
That's a positive note for us to end on.
Very positive.
I think we're at time. Thank you guys so much. It was fantastic to have you here with us today.
Thank you.